A quick note at the top of the episode here. What follows is a addendum to our episode with Dr. Kristen Mark where we discuss sex education. Dylan wrote an article on his blog called The Resistance Hypothesis on Psychology Today where he elaborated on false polarization on the topic of sex education. So we got on a call and chatted about the topic for a few minutes, and that's what follows. So this addendum was recorded after the episode on attitudes about abortion, but before the Supreme Court decision came down. So stay tuned for our second episode about how mental health is linked to abortion and lack of abortion access. It should be dropping in the next few days. Okay, on to this mini episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Bit More Complicated, the podcast where you can hear science-based discussions about important topics, issues, and problems in society and what we can do to make them better. I'm Dylan Selterman at Johns Hopkins University.
And I'm Manny Galvan at UNC Chapel Hill.
Except you're not at UNC Chapel Hill right now, are you, Manny?
No, we're actually both in DC at the same time right now, but not together because I had a bit of a COVID scare, and we were supposed to meet up at the beautiful Martin Luther King Memorial Library and record our first episode in person together. But yeah, now we're separated. I'm just a little 20 minutes away, I think, in DC.
Right on. Well, yeah, we have been hanging out in person a little bit during your trip here, and yeah, we'll do that in-person recording at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe back in July when I come back to DC again. And it's been so cool hanging out. Like, I don't know to what extent our audience knows, but we didn't know each other prior to the start of this podcast. We kind of are doing similar things, both doing science communication, but Dylan heard me on a separate podcast, and then just being the genuine guy that Dylan is, he kind of just reached out, said, I like what you're doing. You mentioned you wanted to start a podcast on that other podcast. Do you want to start one with me? And I was just like, yes, of course. That sounds great. After we like talked and made sure we're kind of on the same page, and we're very much in concert with one another. So excited about the podcast. And then we just started it, and it's been going really well.
Yeah, this is kind of like the How I Met Your Mother story of the podcast origin. So
hopefully it won't take like 40 seasons to go over.
It won't take 9 years and some very weird character arcs in order to make that happen.
Imagine how bored those kids were. Jesus.
Well, Maddie, I really appreciate you indulging me on this episode, which is my idea as a follow-up to our recent conversation with Kristen Mark about sex education, which we published, and I also wrote a follow-up blog post on Psych Today specifically about this topic. And I think this is a good opportunity to revisit some of the points that we made and talk a little bit more in detail about societal attitudes towards sex and the concept of false polarization. So just to give our listeners a little bit more background, first of all, you should definitely go check out our previous episode with Kristen Mark on this topic. We basically talked about people's attitudes toward sex education, what sex education actually is, and why people would support it versus not support it. We also talked a little bit about cross-cultural attitudes. So we talked about differences between Americans and the Dutch, for example, in terms of attitudes towards sex and sex education. And Kristen made a subtle point that, in hindsight, I kind of wish we had double-clicked on in the episode. She basically said if you survey American parents, over 9 out of 10 American parents support sex education in schools. So this is including the vast majority of Democrats and Republicans. But I think we framed the episode also in terms of an article that you had written, Manny, about the quote-unquote groomer dialogue. And I think we extended that maybe a little too far to suggest that the problem in sex education is coming from the American right. And I don't think that is necessarily supported by the evidence. I think what Kristen said is that there is a very small percentage of people who are in opposition to this. So I think that underscores the need for clarity, and this concept of false polarization is when we exaggerate or overestimate the differences in attitudes between political groups, which can actually cause further polarization and animosity, which we definitely don't want. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about that and talk about some more of the nuances in attitudes towards sex in this episode.
Yeah, I think this is an important topic, and it's not just going to matter for sex education. It's going to matter for any issue we talk about, essentially, because there's often these like somewhat of a political divide. But I think it's important to identify what the political divide is and where it exists. And so maybe I think we were just like lacking that nuance in our last conversation. But I do appreciate the opportunity to clarify a little bit. So one thing I want to do is just identify different groups, right? And this gets back a little bit to our episode with Jake Womack and Tom Costello, and we talked a little bit about the difference between like a Democrat versus a Republican, or a liberal versus conservative, and how they're like overlapping quite a bit, right? But they're not perfectly so, right? There are conservatives that are in the Democratic Party. There are liberals that are in the Republican Party, and so these groups make sense and they're consistent, but they're not perfectly so. The other thing that I think we didn't spend too much time dwelling on is the difference between like voters within a party and the party itself.
Yeah.
And we can also talk about the party versus the politicians who are at the top of that party and make the decisions about what policies get passed. And I think this is where the false polarization stuff really comes up. I think there is a consensus. I would call it a liberal consensus. We can get into the data here amongst voters and amongst the average person in society, not party people necessarily, and certainly not politicians, but just amongst people who kind of identify and will vote for one or the other party. There's a lot of overlap in that group between views amongst like liberals and conservatives and Democrat leaning versus Republican leaning. And I think that's where your point about false polarization is super key. When it comes to the parties and politicians within those parties that make policy decisions and vote and stuff, I think there's tons of really ironclad evidence that there's a lot of polarization between decision makers in the two parties. Like, very few Republican legislators vote with Democrat legislators at the national level. And it used to be that they would vote for each other's policies, and now it's very unlikely that happens. And so I think that is more of the thing we were talking about before. In terms of like, why isn't sex education happening? I think that is spearheaded by policymakers in the Republican Party that will stop the passage of that kind of legislation that would that would create a federal mandate that sex education must exist, and it can't be it can't only be at least abstinence education. I think the Republican Party, Republican legislators are the people who stand against that. But I think you're right. Like, Republican voters support it. And this is, we can get into this a little bit more, but like, this is where the argument that like a lot of liberals and leftists will say that Republicans, quote unquote, vote against their own interests. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the polling, lots of Republicans support liberal policies, but then they reliably vote for the Republican Party, which doesn't deliver, which are obstinately against those very policies that they say they support. So I think this is an important distinction here. Like, amongst average everyday people, there is false polarization. Amongst the party leaders and decision makers and legislators, there is true polarization.
Yeah, and I just want to echo something that you're saying. First of all, there's a big difference between the average person who may not even be very politically engaged at all, and may be somewhat apathetic about politics, versus the people who are actually holding office and making policy. So we're definitely not conflating the two. And also, that's not to say that polarization in the general public is zero. There are some statistically reliable and meaningful differences in attitudes, and we can see them to some extent on this topic. Like you're saying, this is the the conversation we're having about polarization is relevant to sex education, but it's relevant to a whole lot of other things too. And we should definitely, I think that may end up becoming a theme throughout our entire show, is talking about how are the average Americans feeling about this. Maybe one thing that we could add is that false polarization is typically measured in terms of preferences for policies. And what we have been talking about here, or what we are talking about here in this episode, is more about societal attitudes. And those aren't exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes polarization can be measured in terms of attitudes, like what people's values are. But I think the false polarization stuff is really important to keep in mind for things that are relevant to our political goals. If we think that we are in a political party that is diametrically opposed to another political party and there's no hope for reconciliation, that itself can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can make our political gridlock even worse when we have that false polarization in our minds. And at the same time, correcting those views and noting points where most people agree about most things, that can be very helpful. So we wanted to talk about that and use that as a framework to discuss sex, but this can be applied to a host of other issues as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a couple things I think are interesting about false polarization. One of them is it suggests a solution to this problem, which is to expand voting rights and expand democratic norms. Because if the more that people vote, the more that people engage with the political system, because everybody agrees, it's more likely that we'll get what we want. There's a large number of Americans who agree on a liberal policy agenda, and they just aren't voting because they don't perceive they perceive some illegitimacy in the political system. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of problems with the political system. We could talk about Citizens United. We could talk about gerrymandering. We could talk about like the vast ways that, I mean, I think this is generally true, but right-wing actors have tried to limit the capacity of voters to influence politics, and instead like have dark money in politics. And it's not to say that it's all right-wing actors. I think a lot of Democrats have used the same mechanisms to enrich themselves. We could talk about like Nancy Pelosi. We could talk about all the old geezers that are in our political system and slowing things down and making it impossible to make change. But I think like false polarization and recognizing it points out that like most people agree, if the people were controlling the democratic structures of this country, we would probably be moving more in the right direction. And so we need to fix our democracy. I think that's the thing I always come to whenever when I look at polls that show that everybody really agrees. It shows that our democracy is not functioning.
Sure. Just to riff on that for a second, I saw something today. I forget where I read this, but the argument was that whenever the United States and our allies are trying to help other countries move toward a democracy rather than like an authoritarian system, we never try to export our system. We never try to say you should have a system where the Congress is elected separately from the president. No, what we say is you should have a parliamentary system, right, where the president is basically like just running errands for Congress, yeah, and they are the leader of the party is the prime minister of the parliament, and right, that system tends to function much better than ours in terms of representing the will of the people, along with proportional representation, ranked choice voting. There's all kinds of things that we could be doing to change how the system works to more effectively represent people. Right. But I think you're right to note that this is connected to the false polarization idea, because the system we have may be, in our minds, kind of exaggerating the differences between political groups to make people think that conservatives are from Mars and liberals are from Venus, when that's actually not true.
Right. Well, voters and people.
Voters,
I think
yes.
In terms of policymakers, there's a stark difference in terms of like, if you just, yeah, and you can see it by just reading the platform of the two parties. Like they're very much in opposition on a lot of issues. They're in support of some of the same issues too. Like you Democrats are very much in support of continuous war, for example, in ways that are very disappointing. And so in some ways, there's not a political party for Americans on a variety of issues that agrees with them. But yeah. All right, thanks for listening. Join us next time on A Bit More Complicated. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our podcast, leave a friendly rating, and share with a friend. If you have a reaction you'd like to share with us, please find us on Twitter at abitmorepod or send an email to morecomplicatedpod@gmail.com.